Hello, you're listening to the Analysys Mason podcast with Tom Rebbeck. Today, we're going to be talking about mobile consolidation in Asia. And to do this, I'm joined by Dion in Singapore and by Ismael Moreno-Gomez in our Dubai office. So both thank you very much for joining. Dion, let's start with you. Just to give a brief overview of the mobile activity, merger activity that we've seen in Asia. There have been quite a few mergers over the last few years. Just to give an overview of those.
Sure. So I think we'll just kind of roll back time to about 5 years ago. 2021 in Indonesia, we seen the Indosat and Hutchison merger. And then in 2022 in Malaysia, we have the Celcom and DG merger that happened. 2023, there were, I guess, two notable countries. First in Taiwan, Taiwan Mobile, TSAR, and FET and APT, and then in Thailand as well with True and DTAC merging. And of course, in Thailand, that was, I guess, one of the first 3 operator to 2 operator consolidations that we've seen in the region. And then in 2024, back in Indonesia, we have XL Axiata and Smartfren merging. And of course, last year, we've seen in Pakistan, Ufone, and in Singapore with Sinba and M1 announcing the merger. So, quite a couple of mergers that has happened. And of course, we've worked on quite a few of them directly as advisors.
Okay, so there's already been quite a lot of activity. What about future mergers? What are you expecting, or what's possible?
So if we scan across, I guess, the Asian markets, I mean, we are tracking, I would say, Bangladesh quite actively, where you have 4 operators right now with the potential, right, of a 4 to 3 operator consolidation and happening. That's one possible market. And then in terms of 3 to 2, we are monitoring Sri Lanka at the moment. While 3 to 2 is not that common, looking at the financial strength of the operators in Sri Lanka, we do feel that might be a potential for further consolidation into a two-player market.
Cool. Ismael, let's turn to you and think about some of the drivers behind all of these mergers and behind any potential future mergers.
Sure. So in 2 of the markets that Dion has spoken about, if we think about Taiwan, we think about Indonesia, to a lesser extent Pakistan, they were really crowded market, right? A large number of operators, which of course intensifies the competition, which in turn affects the return on investment, right? If the ARPU is not growing, but at the same time your capex investment, your capital investment to either develop your 4G network, or in the case of Taiwan, to deploy your 5G network, that intensity of capex coupled with ARPU that is not growing that much due to an intense competition, of course, it generates pressure from investors, from company owners to look at potential way out, right? And one of those is consolidation. And in those particular, in these 2 markets, in Taiwan and Indonesia, the consolidation has been dramatic in a way, significantly reducing the number of players.
Dion, anything more to add to that?
No, I think Ismael has covered most of them. I would just like to add that I would say if you look back 5 years, 10 years ago, perhaps from a shareholder point of view, right? And in certain markets, there would still be a thinking that there's still an ability for me to gain subscriber market share in order to achieve the scale that I require to be profitable. Now, as the mobile markets, I think globally has started to be stagnant and be saturated, I think the realization is that, look, if we cannot grow the top line anymore, then the only other way to gain scale is through consolidation. So from a shareholder perspective, right, I mean that willingness to say, look, let's not fight anymore, let's merge and achieve the synergies and gain the scale that's required. I think that's been one change that I've noticed over the years.
Yeah, and I guess about some of the markets you're talking about, like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, ARPUs are going to be relatively low by international standards, so even more pressure.
Yes. I think in some of the mergers that we've worked on, at least, I mean, there's been also feedback that there is a ceiling, right, in terms of how much that the consumers are willing to pay, especially in low-income developing markets. So the expectations that somehow miraculously ARPUs can grow in the future. I mean, they've realized that, look, it's difficult, and therefore, again, right, providing more impetus for merger to get the cost synergies and to scale up.
Yeah, and is that also in the markets where we've seen 3 to 2 mergers, and potentially there could be further 3 to 2 mergers, is also that very low ARPU level driving that?
I wouldn't say so, because if you look at Thailand as an example. I mean, I wouldn't say that Thailand ARPU is that low. I would say for Thailand, it's one of the more unique examples where the market is actually not small, right? Thailand is not a small country. The ARPU, I would say, is not amongst the lowest that we've seen in the region. But of course, I think from an operator's perspective, I mean, there was a realization that they can be more profitable with only two players. I think one of the main things that drove that consolidation was on the convergence play, where if you look at AIS with both mobile and fixed, at that point in time, True had also mobile and fixed. DTech was the only pure mobile player at that point in time. And of course, they ran into spectrum issues where they were really spectrum constrained. So at that point in time, then there needs to be a decision taken, right? Whether they invest a lot, both in spectrum as well as fixed broadband to roll out, or consolidate with True, which would have given them the ability, right, to compete with AIS, but without having to roll out another network. Right? So I would say Thailand's more unique example. But of course, right, when we talk about what might be next, like Sri Lanka, that would be driven by the lower ARPUs, and I believe that that market is pretty small, and again, right, low ARPU, so it does make sense from that perspective.
Okay, that's probably a good point then to jump on to my next question about regulation and what the views of regulators are. How willing are they to accept mergers? Seems like they've been fairly open to it in the past, but what sort of conditions, if any, are being imposed or are likely to be imposed?
Sure. Or maybe let me just provide my perspectives on how I've seen governments and regulators respond, right? So generally they do not like it, right? Because I think operators tend to want competition in order to drive better consumer outcomes, right? More innovation, lower prices. However, I think there's an increasing kind of a willingness to accept this consideration. And that's because they are trying to balance the need for more pervasive, higher quality connectivity, both for consumers as well as for businesses and for data centers, for AI. All these requires top-notch connectivity. So there is an alternative view that telco infrastructure is becoming more like utility services. And you see that I would say, for instance, in Singapore, in New Zealand, or the National Fiber Coast, the NBN programs. I mean, all these fiber assets are regulated based on a PPM rep cost modeling approach, right? So which is what has been applied in utilities in the past. So there is an increased realization that this is becoming more like a utility infrastructure side. It might not make sense for us to have so much competition. So the acceptance of the merger becomes I think right from that perspective. And just maybe one more point to add is in some markets we've seen that, especially in developing markets, spectrum is seen as a source of income a big source of income for the government. Now, in order for them to be able to generate more income from new spectrum bands that's being launched, operators must be willing to pay and bid, right, in the auction. And we've known in some markets where operators have basically told the government that as it is right now, we do not have the ability to buy the spectrum at the prices that you want to sell them at. So no thank you, right? And therefore, merger becomes something which the government would then accept in order for the operators to have the scale, and then the operators would then have the financial ability to acquire the spectrum, and the government can then.
So they need to be more financially stable so they can afford to buy the spectrum. So even though the government's sort of conflicted, on one hand they maybe don't want to have less competition, but on the other hand they want this source of revenue from selling off spectrum.
Yes, and we've seen kind of a direct correlation, right? Like spectrum auctions had to push back because they were waiting for the mergers to happen before people have money to pay them. I mean, that's my one. I think maybe Ismael would have.
Maybe Ismael, do you want to come in on this as well, on the regulatory, what you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dion was touching on the right points. The change of mind of the regulators, we go 15 years back, consumer was at the center of it. Telecommunication was more profitable than it is now. Companies were making good returns. And then, of course, the consumer has to be at the center. And then a merger could be considered detrimental. But they've realized that financial sustainability is a must for operators, right? They go through heavy investment cycles every technology, right? Let's say every 10 years. And at some point, if the competition is too intense and you cannot really deploy the network, it could start affecting the quality that you offer to your subscribers, and thus sort of in-between approach is, of course, it's in a bit more lenient with those mergers, right? Allow operators to reach a certain scale. The investments are financially sustainable. Then it's, as Dion was mentioning, that in return, and it comes to a point in which it sort of comes back to the regulator, because then they are capable of paying for spectrum. Like certain markets within Asia Pacific actually have seen really sort of high spectrum prices. Also, due a bit to the local regulations, in which, let's say, if an auction goes with unsold spectrum, a regulator could be challenged if in subsequent rounds or if in subsequent auctions that a spectrum is offered at a lower price, because it could be considered that it has not been sold at the right price, which has caused elevated prices. And this is common across quite a few of the countries that we've seen, which puts even more financial pressure. You have lower resources. Consumers still are expecting a nice sort of speeds, but your toolkit is limited, and a consolidation, a merger could potentially unlock a lot of value for the merge operator, having access to these two pools of a spectrum that would allow them to provide much better quality service to the
Okay, makes sense. Let's move to the last question then, just to think about what the main considerations are for operators who are looking at merging or potentially merging. Ismael, let's start with you and then I'll go over to Dion.
Sure. And in essence, it's a radical change, right? If you get merged to another company, everything changes. So I would start with for me, the first and key idea is that this is a decision that you need to take carefully. Of course, we've all seen the benefits that it can potentially bring, but it comes with certain complexities. So you need to prepare well, right? Let's say in the investor thesis, the mergers look all bright and sunny and all rosy. It's not always like that. It's a complicated process. You need to consider commercial, technical, regulatory factors, and it can get a bit complicated. So I would say that for me, that's perhaps one of the key ideas. It's something that can potentially unlock a tremendous amount of benefit, but you need to be well prepared to do so.
Yeah. So first, a couple of things. First one is more on the due diligence, right? You need a very rigorous due diligence exercise to identify the synergies, the dyssynergies, and of course the probability, right? To have a good view on the probability of realizing some of those synergies. Now, in the mergers that I've worked on, of course, we will be helping our clients to look at both revenue as well as cost synergies. And on the cost side, obviously, spectrum network is one of the largest bucket where you derive value from. And in those cases, at least for my clients, the cost bucket, right, they tend to quantify that and also be willing to pay, right, for that. So that's what they see as a more certain valuation that comes out. On the revenue side, yes, there's simulations in terms of how market repair can happen, how potentially low ARPU plans can be taken out of market, and how that might evolve. But there's also a realization that, look, it's not just me, right? It also depends what my competitors do and react, and therefore what we try to realize on the revenue synergy side is not as certain, right? And lots of other factors influence it. So on the revenue side, it's more taken as I would say an upside case, but it doesn't go into kind of the base case, right, of what you want to commit in your offer and your negotiation to the other party. So that's one. Number two is, again, link back to spectrum, and also in terms of your previous question on regulatory front, right? What they might do. Now, in the return of spectrum, right? It's one of the things that government and regulators could ask, right? In a merger scenario, one of the remedies that they might seek to impose. But it is one of the largest value bucket for the two companies merging. So the ability for them to then create, I would say, a minimum spectrum portfolio to say, look, this is what, at minimum, this merger would make sense, right? With. And of course, if the regulatory remedy is more than that, then the deal kind of falls apart. I mean, these conditions need to be discussed, right, within the merger and simulated and made kind of clear, right, to both parties. And I would say then also needs to be some guidance, right, to the regulator on what the operator's view of this might be. Because again, right, a merger tends to, at the end of the day, be beneficial for the government as well, right, as what we discussed. earlier on, and therefore this ability to work towards a meeting point on how much fraction to return and in what bands, I think it becomes critical. And I would say that the last point would then be related to delay in synergies, which sometimes might be, I would say, deliberate. So again, right, you would say, hey, there's ability for us to shrink the distribution network or to optimize the distribution network, or we could, have some headcount reduction that we identified. This would result in job losses or impact on the supply chain. This might be something that governments, regulators tend not to be very happy about as a result of the merger. And therefore, there could be a deliberate phasing or delaying of some of these synergy buckets or actions, right? In order for kind of the operators to be able to have a smoother process to close off the transaction. So I guess, that would be my...
That makes sense. So it's kind of a careful balancing of these different requirements, because obviously that you'd hope to get synergies, but you don't want to be too aggressive in terms of your plan for those, because you want to keep government support, and also you want to have those strong arguments that you can put forward to government as to why it's a good thing for the country, not just for the operator.
Yes.
Okay, great. Very good. Thank you very much, Ismael. Thank you, Dion. Very, very interesting. If you'd like to receive future episodes of the Analysys Mason podcast, please subscribe. We also welcome any comments, feedback, and reviews. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.